Welcome to CityWorks, a production of the City University New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Every month here on CityWorks, we explore the challenges and lived experiences of working people on the job, at home, and in our communities. On this episode of CityWorks, organized labor and the global climate crisis. Rising temperatures are fueling environmental degradation, natural disasters, weather extremes, food and water insecurity, and having a massive impact on the global economy. Around the world, a growing number of labor unions are working together, building coalitions to lead a transition to a climate-safe new economy that is equitable and worker-friendly. Joining us in the studio today are labor and climate movement leaders and activists on the front lines in this critical fight to address climate change. Sweeney is director of the International Program on Labor, Climate and Environment at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and he's founder and coordinator of Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, or TUED, which promotes labor's key role in the climate movement. 126 unions worldwide are part of the TUED network today. Irene Shen, longtime climate organizer and educator, is TUED's lead organizer and coordinator for their Women's Leadership Project for a Public Pathway. Brian Kamanzi is a South African electrical engineer and researcher with TUED, and Ozzi Warwick is General Secretary to the Joint Trade Union Movement and Chief Education and Research Officer of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union in Trinidad and Tobago. He's also founding member and General Secretary of the Movement for Social Justice. Welcome all. What an esteemed group. I feel daunted almost about where to begin. I guess we have to begin with TUED, the meaning of the name. What do you mean by it? What is it intended to do? Let's start with you, Sean.
You would have to start with me. 2012, there was a big conference in Rio de Janeiro, and there was a lot of, it was the Rio Plus 20 conference put together by United Nations Environment Program, Commission on Sustainable Development. There was a big fight among unions over the kind of methods of trying to advance protection of the climate were very embedded in market neoliberal thinking. And a lot of unions didn't want that. Other unions felt, well, that's the way life is these days, and if we can get a seat at the table, some jobs, we'll support it. So we formed TUED. We called it Mission Impossible, and it was in just 2 weeks before Hurricane Sandy hit New York. And that's how it started, and it's grown very quickly.
Well, all these years later, so much bigger and a real seat at least some tables. Tell us a little bit about how the organization looks today and how you operate.
Yeah, well, I think one of the most exciting parts that's happened in the last couple of years is the launch of TUED South. It's a South-South-led platform, and we went to Nairobi, Kenya, and we're together with about 70 trade union leaders from the Global South, and talked about the need for what we think is called the public pathway to a just energy transition. It's the reclaiming of the entire energy sector to public ownership and democratic control, which is, I think, a key piece to the public pathway. And what we found was that the idea of resisting privatization of the energy sector and embracing public ownership was really resonating with unions in the South. And it was something that they could embrace and support. And once we launched TUED South, it's really grown and gotten a lot of traction in all the regions. Well, we've had meetings in Latin America and the Caribbean, and then in Asia Pacific and in Sub-Saharan Africa.
How does this look to you, Brian, where you are in South Africa? What is TUED doing? What does this struggle around public pathway versus private look like?
Yeah, I actually got, in a sense, recruited into TUED from being involved locally in South Africa with what was happening. South Africa's system is still predominantly state-owned. It's in the process of being privatized, and the promotion of neoliberal policies was contested from the trade union movement from the beginning. In about 2012, while I was doing my master's, I was really thinking about what to do and how to contribute, and I'd heard about resolutions that were made by the National Union of Mine Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, They had developed a concept called socially owned renewables, which was very interesting, but it also exposed me to deeper debates about what public energy really meant. And there was pretty high level, compared to where things are now, pretty high level debates that were happening then. And so a young person, I was very excited. I attended a few TUED events and stayed in the loop of that. And you know, you couldn't be involved in South Africa with the fight against privatization without encountering some of TUED's ideas. Partly, unfortunately, because it's not very popular to critique the IMF's policies around climate finance. It's not very popular to say that you want public energy in a place like South Africa, because that also implies to some extent that you support the restoration and the reclaiming of fossil fuel plants which are under public ownership. And that's where things get difficult. But also, that's the exciting part, because when you engage with workers' issues, you actually embrace and take on the fact that in order to transform our world, there are contradictions and we have to actually deal with them.
We're often told in this country that it's a contest or a competition or a sort of painful choice between climate on the one hand and fossil fuel workers on the other. But correct me if I'm wrong, Ozzi, did I hear you represent oil field workers?
Yes, that is correct.
Talk about that.
Yeah, sure. And let me just start so that we can understand, why are we involved? Why are we part of this important network? And it really starts with the emergence of our union in 1937. It emerged out of oil workers struggling against multinationals, and the union would have been at the forefront of the anti-colonial struggles, the fight for independence, the fight for the right to vote, as well as the nationalization of the oil and gas sector. And therefore, we felt it necessary to be part of the TUED network from its inception, because we believe that it has to be public ownership of the energy system.
Why?
Because the private interest, they only seek profits, not people. And let me give a concrete example. Right now, as we speak, we had what is supposed to be a just transition in Trinidad and Tobago. But what in fact happened was the firing and the sending home of thousands of workers. So you had community businesses closed down. You had these small other companies that are related to the value chain. They were closed down. Those workers were sent home.
In the name of transition to a
in
green
the
economy.
name of transition. And those workers, they were never retooled, they were never rehired, they were never retrained. There was no real green jobs, none. It did not exist. And we felt that that cannot be the way. That cannot be the transition. That is unjust, and it is unequitable, and it's unfair. And it is in that regards we felt that the public pathway approach has to be the approach. It has to be built on the idea that people own, control, and manage the energy systems.
But there are people who say the planet is burning by whatever means necessary. We need to get off fossil fuels, and if the private sector is leading this charge, people will just have to figure out their alternatives for themselves. Sean, how do you confront that?
But 30 years since the Kyoto Treaty was negotiated, fossil fuels today are being burned at record levels of coal, oil, and gas. So this reflects very negatively on the policy. Yeah. So they point to a little bit of green renewable energy here and there, and it's quite significant, don't get me wrong, but the energy expansion that's going on, it's not a transition, it's an expansion. So I think what the only conclusion we can reach from this, and however difficult it may sound, we need a massive policy shift towards public ownership. Some governments are doing it, like the Andrés Manuel López Obrador, president of Mexico. He'll be handing over in a few days to Claudia Sheinbaum, a climate scientist and engineer. That's they are basically reasserting the public system, pushing back against the privatized, including nationalizing energy from multinationals. And it's upsetting the Biden administration. It's kind of ironic that Biden, Mr. Climate, is pursuing that. So other countries too. Mexico's not alone in this.
Are there others you'd like to lift up, examples possibly?
In Uganda, actually, I think Uganda was at one point seen as a model of privatization in the South, and they're actually reversing that privatization effort right now and renationalizing elements of their energy sector because the costs were outrageous, and they realized it wasn't actually benefiting the country in the ways that the IMF and the World Bank were pitching it originally.
And where do things stand in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, we stand right now at the forefront of a struggle in order to suggest that there has to be an alternative way. the fact is, Laura, the private pathway approach is failing. As Sean would have mentioned, what we are seeing is an energy expansion because that is driven, in essence, through this private pathway approach that is being pushed by the World Bank. So in terms of Trinidad and Tobago, the idea is to mobilize and organize workers themselves in order to take charge of how this transition will take place. If that don't occur, if we allow simply the private interest to shape the transition, then it will not be a just transition. It will not be a fair transition. It will just be a transition.
Do your workers do your members get excited about the idea of public ownership?
Yes, they do, because they've seen the importance of having national ownership of the critical infrastructure of the society. In addition, the social support infrastructure that exists, workers see a very important link between having the means of the energy systems to support the revenue that will support the social support infrastructure. So it is linked to social services, whether it's health, education, public services, and I think that element is oftentimes overlooked. And it is in that context you'll see the workers mobilizing around that.
I mean, it's really an industrial policy and industrial planning approach to more than just transition, but the whole society. I'm imagining in South Africa, with the history that you have, this is a challenging sell, is it?
Well, it is, especially because the coal unions have played an incredibly progressive role in the fight against apartheid and the birthing of a new South Africa, and have been at the radical edge of transforming democracy in the post-democratic era. Now, the challenge when you're talking about phasing down coal jobs is that really there are real material interests at play, is that workers are not so easily persuaded by promises of things that don't have any strict guarantees to them, and rightly so. History tells them that they should be.
And government in the past was not an agent of positive things for most people.
Yeah. Yes, and I think we should also appreciate that there's different tendencies within movements and different debates, and I think that is healthy. There's, of course, an element that is very skeptical about the transition, skeptical about the role that global north countries are playing, and that they continue to burn fossil fuels at record levels, like Sean is saying. So why should South Africa cut down if these countries are not doing it? And on the other side, there are parts of the union movement who are thinking, how do we actually be proactive and think about a reclaimed public pathway for a transition that is setting our economy on a path that it's never been before, one that is actually genuinely inclusive, in which a new energy system meets the needs of the people. That's something that we've never had, whether it was fossil fuel or green.
There's also a gender aspect, and you have a women's project.
And yes, and also we just launched a women's initiative. And you know, in the energy sector in general, it's incredibly male-dominated, as we all know. And in addition to that, I think across the climate movement, there is a lack or a gap of knowledge around both the technical and the political. And we wanted to create a space for women trade unionists in particular to get an opportunity to really learn about some of those issues so that they can be at the forefront and leading the way in these high-level conversations when we challenge the dominant narratives of capital around the energy transition. And so this is something that we've launched and we've started to integrate into all of our meetings. And next year, we're hoping to have a series of workshops where women trade unionists and some of our allies can actually learn about these issues and become also collectively engaged in discussions where a feminist perspective around the public pathway really grounds women's issues and gender issues.
We'll come back to more of this, and we will confront more pernicious narratives after this short break. You are watching CityWorks. Welcome back to CityWorks. We're talking about organized labor's critical role in the climate movement and about just where things stand after how many years now about green transition, talking about it. We have with us Ozzi from Trinidad and Tobago, Irene and Sean from the trade unions for energy democracy, and Brian here from South Africa. Obviously, what happens in the South is important because no one experiences the negative impacts of climate change more than people in the South, disproportionately people of color, and of course women, young people. This is why this issue is so important, and it's so exciting to be hearing what you're talking about sort of bottom-up involvement on this in this project. Where do we actually stand in terms of what money is on the table, what's been invested, and how we move forward in an energy democracy public pathway to the future kind of a way? Sean?
Well, the investment is definitely going up in the global north. So it's going up because of what they call the policy of de-risking. There's no viable market for a lot of renewable energy projects on market terms and other green tech. So everything depends on subsidies. Rich countries have the capacity to deliver those subsidies. We in the public pathway and the CUED network don't agree with it. We think it should be publicly owned. Why make profitable what would not otherwise be profitable and then have no assets at the end of it? So we believe that that's essential. But in the global south, the investment is, for every $5 invested in the green economy, $1 is invested in the south. And not in the best projects. So we've got a situation where even Larry Summers, we know infamously, basically saying there's just too much debt in the global south. Debt service payments means there's no money left over to do anything, including basic electrification in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So that,
and just
there
to
is
put
no
a pin on it, it's not viable in the market because the competition still from fossil fuels, which is so embedded in the market, is undercutting any kind of new innovation. Is that why?
I wouldn't say so, to be honest.
Consumers say they want to be less polluting.
I wouldn't say it's a complicated question, but it's not strictly because of fossil fuels dominating the market. It's basically the deployment of renewables and the phase down of fossil fuels has got to be a planned project. What investors look for is, when do I get the returns? What will the returns be? And how certain am I of those returns coming? I'm not putting billions of dollars into Africa without guarantees that these governments are going to be able to honor the contracts. And so that is not, it's what they call, it's not an enabling environment for the private sector. So they use these terms, which when you're familiar with them, you realize what's in there. The head of the IMF, if I may, Laura, head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, said...
Monetary Fund.
The International Monetary Fund, in early 2023, was on a panel at the World Economic Forum in Davos, said, well, you can't expect investors to invest in the global south when the returns are not promising. So we have to, and she used the term, sweeten the deal for those guys. There's plenty of money in the world, but it's not going into the global south because they can't secure profits.
Ozzi Warwick, how does that play out in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, I think that plays out in the sense that you have, again, capital using a crisis and the sense of urgency to do what they do best, maximize profits and rearrange the society where labor is displaced, where trade unions, organized labor is displaced. So that what we're seeing is that you have more and more precarious jobs, a proliferation of contract workers, of casual work. You have the removal of labor agreements. You have the attack on trade unions, on benefits, on terms and conditions. It's almost as though they're using the crisis to roll back the benefits that have been established. And this is why it's crucial to have labor at the center of this attempt to transform our society, or otherwise we will in fact go back to the pre-1930 era of where workers would, the value of your labor power was almost next to nothing. And you can feel it when you go around and you just talk to workers in Trinidad and Tobago. They are struggling just to survive, just to reproduce their daily life. It's extreme difficulty.
Well, you say reproduce, and I go back to you and your women, Irene, and the Women's Project, in the sense that labor is a part of this story, but so is health. So is, so is brain development, so is housing, so is transportation, communications. Climate change is affecting all of these sectors. the public pathway could obviously provide a way possibly to think about them all in a coherent kind of way. Is that part of what you're calling for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we call it a pathway because there's many things along this route, right? We're not just talking about.
It's not just the workers in the plants.
Right. It's the thing that public ownership can do is allow for planning, and if you can plan and coordinate, you're not beholden to profit and being, pulled this way and pulled that way. You can make a coordinated plan that makes sense for prioritizing the people's needs, ecological needs, and figure out what's embedded in that plan.
I mean,
forward.
what is the value of your kid not having asthma? How is that negotiated in profit terms? I mean, this is not foreign to you, I'm sure, in your demands on work.
No, it isn't, but it also means, I think the other side of planning is taking on contradictions that exist within the system, which is that today you're in South Africa or you're in Senegal, you have coal plants, you have gas plants that are there and they are going to cause environmental damage. Somebody has to take responsibility for that. The society still has to live with some of the existence of those plants while you're phasing down, while you're doing other plants. So I think this is the other important edge of the tool of the public pathways, is saying we're not going to just pretend like those things aren't happening and hope that private companies do the right thing and comply with the law, because we know that even if you have good laws, they can ignore them. We are saying that we will take it on, as we're betting on ourselves as society. We're going to capacitate our social and economic infrastructure to be able to perform targets and to be able to meet plans, that there's enough hospitals, that there are enough clinics, that we're not incentivizing people to make more hospitals and clinics. We're not incentivizing private energy companies to choose different technologies.
We can externalize those costs to society.
We can simply buy and build that infrastructure ourselves, also acknowledging that some of the same people who occupy those roles in private and public often cut their teeth learning in the public sector, because the public sector, especially in key infrastructure issues, often employs the real critical element of our skills base. So, we talk in such abstract terms, but really, when you talk about energy, the skills base is already in the public sector. So let's expand that, hire the appropriate people, and make the right technology choices through policy, not through incentive.
Coming back to you, Irene, what are you particularly excited about?
Every meeting we have is so hopeful because you can see people feeling ignited by the idea of the public pathway and what's possible there. And I'm also very excited about the Women's Project because, sort of going back to your previous question, just, with planning, you can actually uplift the care economy. You can think about reproductive labor and how it currently exists under capitalism and how it could exist and how it could be valued. And you can build in those priorities into a coordinated effort around a transition. Anyways, there's so many things, but those are some of the big things.
And other particular struggles that you're excited about, victories perhaps you want to tell us about?
I think I would say that when we met in Nairobi, unions came together and supported this idea for a Reclaim and Restore initiative. And we are speaking to comrades in Mexico. This is what we see as potentially as one of the examples, but there's many others. They don't necessarily use the same language. And we're essentially saying that both for pragmatic and transformative reasons, there's a lot of recognition that public utilities can play a key role. Yeah. So we want to be a part of people who are already autonomously doing this, saying, we see we have a common understanding, let's come together and critique this bigger push, because it is a really big international coordinated push. Let's have one of our own. Let's reclaim our infrastructure and also bet on ourselves. So what I'm excited about is more and more of us in the South, more of us everywhere saying, we're going to bet on ourselves. And if we fail, well, we have the world to lose, right? And that's the message that we have not yet absorbed. A bit. Every discussion about the climate crisis is about who's going to give us money, whether rich countries are going to give reparations, probably not. So why don't we bet on ourselves? Why don't we talk about how we're going to plan and implement aspects of our future, whether or not the United States makes this or that decision on their election or any other types of decision. We're taking our future in our own hands.
The world to win, as I ring to it. What can people do internationally if they're watching this, if they're members of a union, if they had a union or not?
Yeah, I think I'd like to add international solidarity. the importance of shared struggles, so that the struggle in Trinidad and Tobago is not in isolation to the struggles here in New York, the struggles across the United States, the struggles in South Africa, the struggles in Asia, in Latin America, and even in Europe. And we can also cross that divide between North and South. We have to build international solidarity around the public pathway approach. And once we do that concretely, we have an opportunity to shift and change how human society is organized, so that we are not beholden to private capital, but we can truly become the owners and the shapers of our own destiny as a people.
Sounds good. Doable. What do you think, Sean?
Energy is the means of production. Think about that literally. If it is, then the struggle for energy has to be top priority for all progressive forces in the world and all human beings who realize that a transition to a safe, low-carbon society cannot depend on the profit-loss calculations of private investors. It's failed, and we need a new approach. The public pathway offers that. It's still in development stages, but it's resonating, and unions are gravitating towards it.
You get the last word, and I look forward to your next update. Thank you all. Thank you, Sean
Laura.
Sweeney, Brian Kamanzi, Irene Shen, and Ozzi Warwick. Wonderful speaking with you all and learning about TUED's continuing work. That is it for CityWorks this time. If you have comments or questions, write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu, and be sure to download the new CUNY TV app, where you can watch this show and all of CUNY TV's programming. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for joining us.